Okay, we're going to get started. I know we have a few more people who will be trickling in, but it's after 1, so we're going to go. I'm Tina Close, I'm the activity coordinator here. I am very happy to introduce Richard Higgins, who is going to talk about Thoreau and the language of trees. He is an author, he is a Concord resident. We are very, very pleased to have him. Please give him a warm response. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be in town. As Tina mentioned, I do live the other side of the Rotary on Grove Street, and thanks to Thoreau, I've really come to love the trees in this town. And I wrote an introduction to Concord's trees for the town website. I'm on the Concord Conservation Restriction Stewardship Committee, and Thoreau turned me into a photographer of trees, and so I have an exhibit. You have 4 more days. It's not easy to get to, but at the Walden Pond State Park Visitor Center, my tree photographs, or some of them, are there through the end of this month. And one last announcement, my book is here. I happen to have 3 extra copies. They're $24. If anyone wants to buy one, they may. But I'm here to talk about our friend, Mr. Thoreau. Well, he was captivated by trees, and they played a huge role, I think a under-recognized role in his creativity as a writer, his work as a naturalist, of course, his philosophical thought, and even his inner life, his emotional life. He had this emotional bond with trees, but he also understood them the way as well as anyone has, really, in his time, in his day, or since. When Thoreau wrote in the Maine woods that the poet loves the pine tree like his own shadow in the air, he was talking about himself. In short, he spoke their language. Now, why did Thoreau like trees? Their beauty and form delighted his eye. Their wildness and perseverance struck a chord in him. And you could say he even emulated their tenacious hold on earth by remaining rooted in one landscape for the most part his whole life here in Concord. Now, human nature seemed kind of bent to Thoreau, but trees were upright and virtuous. They spoke of the, quote, ancient rectitude and vigor of nature. Nothing, Thoreau said, stands up more free from blame than a pine tree. Old trees linked Thoreau to a realm of time not counted on the town clock, an endless moment of fable and possibility. They reminded him, these old trees reminded him, he said, that I too am a descendant of the, quote, heroic race of men of whom there is tradition. And he was speaking about the ancient Greek poets and philosophers he so loved. And old trees sort of connected him to that moment in the past. And trees were his teachers. Thoreau called the shedding of leaves in the fall a sylvan tragedy, but he knew that the leaves would enrich the soil, and in time, as he wrote, stoop to rise. I love that. The leaves stoop to rise in new trees. And by falling so airily, so contentedly, he said, they teach us how to die. And finally, trees expressed unfathomable mystery to Thoreau. He saw them as spires pointing beyond themselves, and the forest as a threshold to heaven. Now those, believe it or not, are just some of the ways that Thoreau saw trees. I actually explore a few others in my book. But today I'd like to talk about chiefly his personal response and personal observation of trees. His poetic response, his study of them as a naturalist, and a little bit about what they meant to him. And I have some of Thoreau's words and my own photographs to illustrate my points. Now, Thoreau's descriptions of trees were often very fanciful. A yellow birch was a flaxen-haired maiden in a golden jacket of curling bark. An oak was an athlete with well-developed muscles. White pines, great harps upon which the wind plays its music. But Thoreau's writing about trees was always firmly grounded in detailed observation, in his extraordinary eye for trees. So he really carefully observed trees. He looked at them on his rambles every day, observing their shape, color, texture, stance, and measuring and even sketching them. And a marvelous thing about working with Thoreau's journals for my book was that it's full of 300 or 400 of these sketches. He was basically great at everything he did, but he was a very good draftsman, artist, and these are just some of the trees in the journal. In other words, these are he actually drew these in the journal, which is at the Morgan Pierpont Library in New York City, and you can go down there and see them after being run through the mill in various ways. Okay. His eye took in all: root, trunk, bark, branch, and crown, leaf, blossom, and cone. Now, it was these real trees that he observed that made those imaginary ones that I mentioned before seem so solid on the page. Now, it's true that Thoreau did have the advantage of extraordinary eyesight. He writes in the Maine Woods about seeing a devil's needle, which is what they call the dragonfly, a half-mile off on Lobster Lake. I mean, he really had incredible eyesight. But it took more than a keen eye to see trees the way he did. The eye, Thoreau said, cannot see on its own more than any other ball of jelly. It took a desire to see, what he called an intention of the eye. Quote, "There is not a grain more of beauty in the landscape than we are prepared to see," he wrote in Autumnal Tints, his magisterial ode to trees, an essay, one of his natural history essays, and I think the best short introduction to Thoreau and trees you could find, Autumnal Tints. So he writes in that, you have to be prepared to see the beauty, and he makes an analogy. The hunter, he said, enters the woods intent on seeing game, and so it is with, quote, him who shoots at beauty. He will not bag any if he does not already know its seasons and its haunts, and the color of its wing, if he has not dreamed of it. When he has, however, he flushes it at every step. And Thoreau was certainly very intent on seeing trees, especially the details that separated one tree from another. This is an oak on Lexington Road 2A, right across from the one of the farm stands in the park. A tree seen against other trees is a mere dark mass, but against the sky it has parts, symmetry, and expression, he wrote January 26, 1852. And I love that so much, I almost titled the book, Against the Sky, a Tree Has Parts. The fine tops of trees, he wrote, are so relieved against the sky that I never cease to admire the minute subdivisions. Now, Thoreau loved the shapes and forms of trees. Here's a pasture oak. I think this is probably certainly one of the last great pasture oaks left in Concord, and there are not very many. It's a red oak, about as old as Thoreau would be, 200 years old. It's at Hutchins Farm on Monument Street. So the shapes and forms of trees. This is the vase-like Davis elm, as I call it, in front of the Concord Center for Visual Arts, right across from First Parish. But he loved the way the elm's branches flewed up and out very gracefully. That's just a split pine, double-leadered pine, and off of Westford Road, maybe. I'd say 90% of the photographs that I take of trees are just of common trees right here in Concord. I mean, they're not exotic at all. This one is fairly exotic. I traveled all the way to the town of Lincoln to take this in front of the Lincoln Public Library. Does anybody know what this is? I didn't know, I had to look it up. It's a catalpa tree. But how it has that peppermint twist shape, I just have no idea, but that's what it is, a catalpa. All right, so he loved the shapes and forms of trees, but even their stance, the way they stood, the way they hugged the earth, somehow revealed their character to him. These are just up the street from me at the North Bridge, Buttrick's Mansion on the hill by Liberty Street. This is a favorite photo because it sort of underscores what a both great photographer and fraud that I am, because this I took with like a very cheap point-and-shoot camera on Interstate 93 in New Hampshire. And if you take enough photos, you'll get a good one every now and again. And that's what was just good luck here. But it's actually looking over toward above Plymouth, New Hampshire, really on the highway. But you know, of course, it's not a good thing to be looking at the trees while you're driving, as my wife often reminds me. But if we do look, we will be amazed at what we see. Domino Road, Gold's Gym. Let's see, yeah, right over there. That's Domino Road. I mean, the woods behind woods behind Action Unlimited. That's where these gorgeous trees are. This is the Forest Hill Cemetery, next to which I used to live. And this too is Forest Hills. I have a special fondness, I don't know why, for trees and cemeteries. They so often seem to almost shelter or take care of the stones. You know, plus, in a cemetery, a tree doesn't have much competition, and it can really go full stream to be whatever it wants to be.
What cemetery is that?
That is Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain. It's the second greatest garden cemetery after Mount Auburn in this area. Thoreau loved tall trees. Towering white pines like this white pine in Lincoln Conservation Land, the majestic pasture oaks, we saw one, the graceful elms that enclosed Concord in a canopy of calm. Here is another elm in Little Compton, where we go on vacation in the summer. This is the theme here is Thoreau loved big trees. This is an amazing tree. It's the tree that I've visited the longest and know the most about. It's a white oak. It's off of Westford Road on the Neshoba Brook. No, not Neshoba. Is it Neshoba Brook? But it's right there by Lindsay Pond Road, between Lindsay Pond and Westford Road. I think it's Neshoba Brook. And it's 19 feet 6 inches around. You can barely see some stones in the left there. I don't know if you can just make it out, you know. So that's a wall, and this was almost certainly a pasture tree that the farmer decided to leave up. And I call this tree Big Guy, and as I have pictures from 2005, I'm almost embarrassed to admit, but also more recent, and more recently, the tree has been not doing well. And, you know, trees are mortal, like we are. It's very, you know, you kind of expect them to be older and somehow more immortal than we are, but they're not. And yet this particular tree wears its age, I think, with great dignity. And this is my friend Big Guy, maybe about a year ago, and he had these massive leaders. You can't imagine how big his limbs were, and that what looks like a dragon eating him, that's one of his leaders, as they call them. But there are others barely visible that are just as big. A totally massive tree, but what dignity! The way he stands there, you know, I really admire that. It really affects me. So,
excuse me, what do you mean by pasture trees?
A pasture tree is a tree that usually a single large tree that a farmer leaves in a pasture to shelter the sheep or whatever, cows, and for appearance. But of course, he wants mainly to farm or graze the land, so he doesn't want a lot of trees. But he leaves one signature tree in a pasture. Okay. All right. This calls for a story on its own. When this is a tree in Lincoln. Now, when Thoreau was alive, of course, Concord was really very deforested. And in particular, the tall pines, like this kind of tree, were gone because they, were building with them, using them for ship masts. But they were among the first to go, were these very tall trees. So Thoreau lived from 49 to 1862 at 255 Main Street. And it's at the corner almost of Thoreau Street and Main Street above the library. His family lived at 3, possibly 4 houses right there on Main Street there, between the library and Thoreau Street. At 2 of the buildings are now part of Concord Academy. But from his 3rd floor, he could see the train going by, and he would see a train bearing a huge, long 100-foot pine, shorn of its bark. It was on its way to a mill somewhere to be cut up. And he said, "Oh my God, Concord is nothing to compare to that, 100-foot tree." It just made him so sad, Well, as we'll get to later, or I think, yes, well, I'll mention later that Thoreau had the wisdom to know that nature would be reinstated to some extent. And he didn't predict exactly the return of the forest, but he somewhat did. Well, he was, of course, very right. And trees have come back. And now we have this tree, which is the tallest eastern white pine in eastern Massachusetts. It's 150 feet and 1 inch. Now, where is this tree? This tree is 0.9 miles south of this cabin at Walden Pond. This is off of Fairhaven Bay, off of Old Concord Road. It's in Lincoln, but it's there's a big field near, if anyone knows Linden Farm. Well, anyway, it's about just below Walden Pond, and there's this group called the Native Tree Society, and they go around measuring trees, and they discovered this one. So 150 feet, who could possibly have guessed?
Is that the tallest in the state? Or
in eastern Massachusetts. Now, the head of this Native Tree Society, Bob Leverett, who's a well-known and wonderful guy, he has found something like 170 white pines taller than 160 feet, almost all of them in western Massachusetts, many of them at Mohawk Trail State Park, and others at other state parks around there, kind of in inaccessible areas, and for various reasons the trees survived, but few people know how many tall white pines there are in Massachusetts. All right, so Thoreau loved small and common trees just as well. And he also loved the most ordinary things about them. Rotting logs and dead leaves fascinated him. Quote, "Pitch pine cones, very beautiful," he wrote, November 9th, 1851. "Not only the fresh leather-colored ones, but especially the dead gray ones." So he just, death and trees just as much a part of everything else. No detail was too small. Excuse me, I'm going to... nothing was too small for Thoreau. Even a knot in a barn board could catch his eye and cheer him with the thought that this board that's now squared off and nailed together and part of a square structure once grew free and curvy in the forest. Lichens were magical to Thoreau. College Road, again, near my house. Anyone know why College Road is called College Road?
Oh, no, I just know where it is.
Only because my wife, Jenny Rankin, was minister of First Parish for 15 years do I know that when the the Provincial Congress fled Boston in 1775, they met at First Parish in Concord, at Wright Tavern, but also Harvard College, that's what I'm thinking, came out to Concord for a year. And the boys lived on this road that's off of Barrett's Mill Road, and so now it's called College Road. And it's happened, yeah, I thought I got that name from the Harvard boys here for one year. Lichens were magical. The beauty of lichens with their scalloped leaves, the crinkled edge, he exclaimed. I could study a single piece of bark for hours, how they flourish. Thoreau, again, his focus on even the smallest thing. He took apart pine cones to understand how there's a beautiful silken membrane that encases the seed. It's at the bottom of these scales, that kind of gray thing. And the seed is in there, and there's a little membrane of tissue around it, and this tissue feeds the seed from the mother tree. But when the seed is ready to go, this membrane becomes a parachute, and it wafts the seed through the air. And Thoreau discovered this and was amazed and would take apart these pine cones to try to discover, how could this work? How could this be? So this kind of close examination was more than mere observation to Thoreau. It was an act of attention, a form of contemplation. The eye, he wrote, has many qualities which belong to God more than to man. Now, Thoreau was especially exuberant about trees in winter. The rest of the year, he had to, of course, he lived in town, right? He did go to the Cape 4 times and to Maine 4 times, which many people fail to realize, but otherwise he was here. And so he had to make the landscape look new by his sheer force of his imagination. But winter, the snows of winter did it for him, setting off the dark forms of the trees against the white snow and disclosing them anew. And I share his love of trees in winter. This is in New Hampshire, in Thornton, New Hampshire. Even the shadows that trees cast in winter, he wrote, quote, are more distinct than at any other time, not dark masses merely, but finely reticulated. Maybe it was not last February, but the February before that. Actually, it was April 1. There was an April 1 snowstorm, and I knew it was my last chance to go out for the season to get photos of trees in winter. And this is at North Bridge, shadows of trees. See a little fox track or something there. That's Anger's Pond, the Concord Rod and Gun Club pond on Barrett's Mill Road. Oh, and this is Shadow Tree. Shadow Tree. I liked this photo anyway, but I like it much more now that the left side of that tree completely broke off last winter. It's on Liberty Street, directly across from the Buttrick's mansion. It's on that hill, and it will never again look as beautiful as it did that day. So I'm glad I have that photo. Frost, Thoreau wrote, can cover the fields and woods with a, quote, sparkling ice armor, and hang the grasses with innumerable diamond pendants that jingle merrily when brushed by the foot of the traveler, turning a winter walk into the wreck of jewels and the crash of gems. Thoreau described how the snow reveals trees in 1860. A snowstorm which began in the night is now 3 to 4 inches deep. I see how the trees, especially apple trees, are suddenly relieved against the snow, black on white, every twig as distinct as if it were a pen and ink drawing the size of nature. The snow being spread for a background, each tree is distinctly outlined against it. It is a moist snow lodging on trees, leaf, bough, and trunk. And this again is 2 apple trees in Thornton, New Hampshire, where my family used to go for many years. Now, I share Thoreau's fascination, AKA obsession, with trees in winter. I'm not like I'm 67, but I'm like a boy on Christmas morning. When a big snow, I'm out there right away with my camera. And I won't show you many, but these are some of my shots. This is a Monument Street in Concord. Again, College Road, just behind the tennis courts there. Barrett's Mill Road, there's McGrath Farm. Well, what used to be, now it has a new name, but that's at Walden Pond. That's the trail going down to Haywood Meadow. And those two guys are at the Acton Cemetery on Concord Road, right near Great Road, near Trader Joe's and Staples and all of that cemetery. Thoreau also saw trees with the eye of a poet, and he turned to the woods as a font of metaphor and figurative language. Thoreau said he fed his poetic imagination on trees the way a moose browses its leaves and buds. I'm sorry, I missed, that was one more winter shot. I always do this. That's Walden Pond with an unusual swirl there on it. So now we're up to Thoreau as a poet, and he says he fed his imagination on trees the way a moose browses its buds and leaves. And what he wrote was this: "For years I browsed on the pine forest edge against the horizon. I ranged about like a gray moose, looking at the spiring tops of the trees, and fed my imagination on them. Where was the sap, the fruit, the value of the forest for me, but in that line where it was relieved against the sky? That was my woodlot. That was my lot in the woods, the silvery needles of the pine straining the light." And that's, of course, very beautiful on its own, and even more so when you think that in Thoreau's day, any man of means in Concord had his own woodlot. And so Thoreau is sort of playing with that notion that this imaginary line was his lot in the woods. Another poetic example, and as a scarlet oak leaf dies in autumn, he wrote in autumnal tints, it acquires more color, reflects more light, and spreads more joy as its bodily matter, quote, melts away in the light. And what he wrote was, this is in autumnal tints, the leaves of the scarlet oak lifted higher and higher, putting off some earthiness and cultivating more intimacy with the light each year, have at length the least possible amount of earthy matter and the greatest spread and grasp of skyey influences. There the leaves dance arm in arm with the light, fit partners in those aerial halls. So intimately mingled are they that, what with their slenderness and glossy surfaces, you can hardly tell at last what in the dance is leaf and what is light. And one more poetic example of his poetic vision of trees. January 1859, he was walking home to Concord through a young oak wood in Stowe. And oaks are among the trees, most species of oaks. There's a name, I always forget it, but there are a few trees that retain, hardwood trees, that retain their leaves in winter. It begins with an M, but white oaks are among them. And so, they kind of cling on in a withered way, they don't drop. So Thoreau hears the sharp, dry rustle of the few withered leaves clinging to these young oak trees, and he writes, "This is the voice of the wood now. This is the voice of the wood now. It would be still and dreary here in this lot, in Stowe, if it weren't for these leaves that hold on. It sounds like the roar of the sea, suggesting how all the land is seacoast to the aerial ocean. It is the sound of the surf, billows of air breaking on the forest like water on rocks and sand and rocks. It's remarkable how universal these grand murmurs are, these backgrounds of sound, the surf, wind in the forest, waterfalls, which yet in their origin are essentially one voice, the earth voice, the breathing or snoring of the creature. The earth is our ship, and this is the sound of the wind in her rigging as we sail. Now we're going to turn to Thoreau as a naturalist, and these are birch buds. I always remind people they're not just birch buds. They're birch buds in front of E.O. Wilson's retirement community in Brookhaven in Lexington, because I gave a talk there. So his thorough studies of trees as a naturalist began in the year around 1850, 1851, and this gave him yet another lens on trees. He started to identify them by species in his journal, or their Latin name, and record data such as the number of stamens in their buds, or when they leaf out, quote, the yellow birch first, then the black, then the white or paper birch, close quote, and when they turn color in fall. And he began to count their annual growth rings to learn about their lifespans. But the main thing that interested him as a naturalist was the mystery of succession, why one species follows another. He was amazed to discover that even in a white pine grove, and you can test this yourself, in which it appears to be exclusively a white pine grove, okay? There doesn't seem to be a single hardwood. But if you look carefully enough, and of course he did, quote, as often as every 5 feet, a little oak sapling 3 to 12 inches high. Now, yeah, this is in Tobin Woods off of Strawberry Hill Road. Thoreau knew that the oak saplings would eventually die for lack of light and nutrients unless the pines were removed. Conversely, pine saplings shelter under oak trees in an oak forest, and they too are blocked from growing unless the oaks are cut down or burned down. Now, other people recognize this pattern, okay? So he wasn't the person who discovered the pattern, but nobody really knew why. And what Thoreau couldn't understand how either species could take root when there were no similar trees nearby to drop their seeds. How could that be? So he figured it out by observing how trees dispersed their seeds. He literally chased after squirrels and dug up their booties of pine cones and tested their aerodynamic qualities and examined the scales. And after painstaking observation of several years, he was certain that the wind transmitted lighter seeds, like white pine seeds, and that birds and small animals spread the heavier ones by eating and pooping them or carrying them on their fur. So then trees then propagate, he concluded, by, quote, by the balloon or parachute or hook or barbed spear. Now, Thoreau wasn't the first person to suggest that forests naturally regenerate, but he was the first person to fully understand the role of wind in animals and even unwitting farmers who cut down trees. He was the first to document it, and he was the first to coin the term succession. So his observations should have been a major advance in the study of forest dynamics. But the first foresters later in that century, the 19th century, could not accept the work of a transcendentalist, even a scientific one, and so they ignored it. This incredible scientific research that Thoreau did was completely ignored until about the 1960s. Now, his lecture on what he found out, the succession of forest trees, gave it September 1860, was received better and printed more often than any lecture in his lifetime. It was in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, I think it was called, and buoyed by its success of his lecture. And feeling a new sense of mission, Thoreau began busily collecting data on the life cycle of trees, surveying the town's forests, estimating growth rates by the amount of space between their tree rings, between their annual rings, clawing at the roots of trees to expose hidden shoots or clues to the history of the tree. And while doing this, on December 3, 1860, he caught a cold that turned into bronchitis, and then the tuberculosis from which he never recovered. His death 2 years later would have been premature in any case, but the energy and excitement he brought to the study of trees in the fall of 1860 makes it all the more tragic. And his life was doubly tragic in that it overlapped almost exactly with the nadir or greatest extent of deforestation in the region. By 1850, save for wetlands and inaccessible woods or land just not fit to farm, Concord was largely shorn of its trees. Quote, every larger tree which I knew and admired is being gradually culled out and carried to mill, Thoreau wrote on December 3, 1855. I miss them as surely and with the same feeling that I do the old inhabitants out on the village street. Now he felt their loss more acutely for knowing, as few people did, the ecological and psychological value of trees. They were, quote, rivers of sap flowing, quote, from the atmosphere and emptying into the earth, he wrote, and they were also essential to the human spirit. Quote, what would human life be without forests, those natural cities, he wrote. And Thoreau's wisdom about trees speaks to us today. After famously declaring in his essay, Walking, in wildness is the preservation of the world, he immediately links trees directly to wildness. The next sentence is that every tree sends forth its fibers in search of the wild. And he also writes in that essay that it is from the forest, quote, come the tonics and barks which brace mankind. Now, the current understanding of trees as carbon sinks that help absorb and reduce global warming make his words seem almost clairvoyant. A century before the term nurse logs became popular in forest ecology, Thoreau said that pines were nursemaids to the oak saplings that take root around them. He described trees as fountains of water and purifiers of the air. He did not use the word ecology, that was coined by a German in 1866, but he saw forests as whole landscapes, right? It's an entire unit, and it transcended public and private boundaries, and he urged that they be protected as such. Now, many of you have read or heard of the Hidden Life of Trees by the German forester Peter Walbin, and his idea that trees exchange signals through the earth across fungal social networks, he calls them. Now, the biology of that was unthinkable, obviously, to Thoreau. It wasn't anywhere near the state where he could begin to think that. But, and this is Thoreau's genius, and why I so love working with him, he intuited all these things. He intuited it. He intuited that they could perhaps communicate. On March 10, 1859, it's sugar season, and he's sensing that the sap has begun to flow in the woods, and he writes in his journal, such is the genialness of nature, that the trees appear to have put out feelers by which our senses apprehend them more tenderly. And despite the relentless cutting of woods in his lifetime, Thoreau foresaw that, quote, one day they will be planted and nature reinstated to some extent, as I mentioned earlier with that tall tree. And certainly that has been true and proved true in spades. Now, Thoreau was a naturalist. The scientific lens on trees was useful to him, but very limited. He wasn't a gung-ho scientist. He did not believe nature could be known reductively as an object under a microscope. The purely scientific view was too dry, it was too literal, it was too narrow. The pursuit of the parts obscured the whole. Quote, the man of science studies nature as a dead language, he said. Now, this doesn't mean that Thoreau was against science or the scientific study of trees by any means. Merely that science must complement or supplement its work with a broader, wiser, more sympathetic understanding of trees, alert not only to the quantitative facts, but the message or story or mystery that the tree presents. And I very unfairly put on the screen here two gentlemen from the University of Arizona Laboratory of Tree Ring Research in 1951 examining a slice of a giant sequoia. Nevertheless, what Thoreau said is true. Wisdom does not inspect, but behold. We must look a long time before we can see. Now, Thoreau, the trees also offered, Thoreau wanted to know then not only what trees were, but also what they meant, what they signified. He saw them as expressions of universal laws and spiritual truths, and he wrote about them as both natural fact and parable. They were metaphors for his philosophical thought. Each new idea, he said, was like a bud on a branch, and it corresponded to a new rootlet forming in the earth. The most clear and ethereal ideas, he wrote, ally themselves to the earth, the primal womb of things. They put forth roots as soon as branches. They are eager to be soiled. The thought that comes to light is wombed and rooted in darkness. And just one more example of how trees were philosophical symbols and metaphors to him is the leaf, which Thoreau saw as the leaf as the ideal form, a permanent template found everywhere in nature, in the human hand, in the feathers and wings of birds, in antlers, and even, yes, in fissures in the ice. And these are some tree-like cracks in Walden Pond that I found a couple winters ago. And it almost, not only, you can understand the main crack there, but then those, it looks like leaves on top, really. I mean, that's just the ice. That's all it is. That's all it is. And then this one is extraordinary. This was this is an actual oak leaf of some type frozen into the pond and sitting at the end of an imaginary branch that is just a crack in the ice. Okay. So finally, we're going to wrap up here with the last general point I want to make is that trees were Thoreau's spiritual companions. Excuse me. They were spires, he said, that lifted his vision to heaven. And just what heaven meant to him is unclear, but he used it often, believe me, including in all its forms, heavens, heavenly, heaven-like, etc. 48 times in Walden. 48 times in Walden. He continually linked heaven and trees. By fall, an industrious red maple has grown, quote, nearer heaven than it was in the spring. Elms, quote, take a firmer hold on earth that they may rise higher into the heavens. Loggers felled a majestic pine that for 2 centuries had been, quote, rising by slow stages into the heavens. He writes a prayer on a leaf, and the, quote, the bough springs up the scroll to heaven. An oak sapling is driven back to earth again 20 times, quote, as often as it aspires to the heavens. So I have a whole separate talk, and I've written essays on the topic of Thoreau's very iconoclastic religiosity, but he was a deeply, deeply spiritual and even religious person. But you'll have to just take my word on that. Thoreau preferred not to define what he meant when he spoke about these things. All that mattered to Thoreau was the experience of the sacred in nature, not the theology, not the description. And trees often led him to it. They were his shrines and burning bushes, he wrote. Those were his exact words. The forest, his cathedral. He drew more inspiration from its spires than from the whitewashed village steeple, beneath which he was baptized and buried here in Concord. Alone in a distant wood, he wrote, quote, I get what others get from church going. And also in the essay Walking, he wrote, when I would recreate myself, I seek the darkest wood, the thickest and most interminable swamp, and enter it as a sacred place, a sanctum sanctorum, holy of holies. And just the second to last slide here, Walking in a snowy pine forest, Thoreau became aware of a concealed mystery somehow. And he wrote, "You glance up these paths, closely embowered by bent trees bent by snow, as through the side aisles of a cathedral, and expect to hear a choir chanting from their depths. You are never so far in them as they are far before you. Their secret is where you are not, and where your feet can never carry you." So Thoreau wrote most beautifully about the spirituality of trees, and most forthrightly in the Maine woods. And he begins by noting the uses to which a white pine is put. And he says, well, I've been to the lumber yard, and the carpenter shop, and the tannery, and the lamp black factory, and the turpentine clearing, but when at length I saw the tops of the pines waving and reflecting the light at a distance high over all the rest of the forest, I realized that the former were not the highest use of the pine. It is not their bones or hide or tallow that I love most. It is the living spirit of the tree, not its spirit of turpentine, with which I sympathize and which heals my cuts. It is as immortal as I am, and perchance will go to as high a heaven, there to tower above me still. So I'll close with a picture I took of Thoreau's grave at Sleepy Hollow in Concord. The Thoreau family grave is, the Thoreau family plot is behind the three pines there on the left. I did not expect to find Thoreau's words borne out quite so faithfully, but it was a great pleasure to see that the pines are indeed towering over him still. So thank you very much. So I would be delighted to answer any questions. They don't have to be profound questions. They can be any kind of question. Yeah.
Either in Foxborough or Stowe, there's a selectman in Boston who bought 500 acres or 1,000 acres or something. How can you get to that area? I've tried to get to that area.
Oh, I can tell you about that. I have a whole chapter on that. It's called Inches Wood. Inches Woods is in Boxborough, but formerly in Stowe when it was a King's land grant to a man named Henderson Inches, who was a grandee, a selectman and wealthy man, and he kept these woods and did not cut them down. And Thoreau discovered them in November of 1860. It was blown away that they were first growth, primitive trees. So you can get to it. Sadly, you will find a subdivision with the streets named after the trees.
I found that street, but then where do we go from there?
I can tell you, if you go on the internet, there's a guy named Alan. I'll tell you in a minute who's mapped this whole thing and has a whole website about these trees. It's called Inches Wood, and in the 1890s, Herbert Wendell Gleason, who was sort of Thoreau's archivist or photographer, he recorded all of Thoreau's Concord visually. He was just an amazing photographer. He went out to Inches Wood and he photographed this chestnut tree that was still standing in 1890. So this chapter in my book is Kingdom of Primitive Oaks. That's not an oak, but and it's there's a few areas of it that are not developed now, but the old trees are gone. I mean, when the oaks were cut down for the U.S. Navy, the Union Navy in the Civil War, by a New Hampshire forest baron named John Trickey. And the white pines grew up in place of the oaks, just like Thoreau predicted. And in 1913, the New England Friction Match Company cut down all those white pines. There are a few, but not very many. So it's more a place of the imagination. But if you, I'll give you some more information if you come up afterward. But yeah, anyone else? No? Oh yes, forgive me, sure.
The old growth forest was full of maples and oaks and I don't know what other kinds of trees, but I know they were hardwood and they were magnificent trees. But then when they died, the second growth was more like white pine and it was softwood.
Yeah.
And it's not as valuable, so I don't know where the old growth forest still stays, some of it.
Well, there is old growth in Massachusetts, and there's a whole movement to document it. And the Native Tree Society, again, has identified many pockets of old growth. And there are books being written about it. Joan Maloof recently wrote a book about the old growth forests around the country, but several in New England. And if you were, I just saw a film about the old growth forests, of New England. It stars the guy who's the head of the Native Tree Society, Bob Leverett, and I can't think of the name of it, but people are working on it. You can, if you Google it, you can find it. It's mostly out in Western Massachusetts, and there's not a lot, but there's some.
But they are trying to save what they can save.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. In Cummington, Mass, at the home of who is a great poet, Bryant. The Bryant Homestead is one of the areas with old growth, and I've been out there with white pines that are, 165 feet. So they exist, and people care and are trying to save them. Was there a question over there? Yes.
It's not a question. I've never been to the Harvard Forest, but I've heard a great deal about it. Would it have some old growth?
I don't know if it has old growth. That's become a very specialized term, and or the more scientists study it, the more they sort of distinguish even different types of old growth. I don't know if there's any actual old growth there, but it's in Petersham, Mass, and it's very beautiful. I've been out there. It's worth the trip, but I can't answer if it's old growth or not. All right, well, thank you all very, very much. And if anyone wants a book, I have 3 here.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.